In 2016, the most recognizable Christmas voice in the world went completely silent. No tours, no albums, no interviews, no stage. The man who had spent 2 decades making millions of people feel that joy was still possible, simply vanished. And the reason no one had predicted it, not even him. There are performers who disappear because the world stops wanting them, the applause fades, the bookings dry up, and the silence that follows is the silence of being forgotten. That is one kind of disappearance. But there is another kind, the kind where the world is still calling, where the arenas are still sold out, and the albums are still charting, and the performer walks away anyway, not because the world stopped needing him, but because something needed him more. Michael Bublé's disappearance in 2016 was the second kind. Understanding what he walked away from, and why, and what it cost him to come back, that is the real story, not the one printed in entertainment columns, the one that lives underneath all of that, the one that changed what every song he had ever recorded actually meant. Michael Bublé grew up in Burnaby, British Columbia, in a household where music was a natural language rather than a career ambition. His grandfather, Mitch Santaga, introduced him to the great American standards, Sinatra, Bennett, Nat King Cole, not as artifacts to be studied, but as living emotional documents to be inhabited. The boy absorbed this completely. By his early teens, he was not merely a fan of that music, he was in some essential way already inside it. The path from Burnaby to global recognition was neither smooth nor swift. Through his late teens and most of his 20s, Michael performed at wedding receptions and corporate events and small clubs where audiences talked through his sets without looking up. He sang for rooms that had not come to hear him, and he found a way to do that night after night without letting the indifference extinguish what made him a performer in the first place. Most people confronted with years of invisibility eventually stop. Michael did not stop, he refined. When a demo tape, paid for by his grandfather's savings, eventually reached David Foster, one of the most celebrated record producers in the world, the door that had been closed for a decade finally opened. His debut album in 2003 found audiences that no industry logic had predicted. The music reached people who had been waiting for exactly that sound without knowing it, warm, emotionally present, rooted in a tradition that had been largely absent from popular music for 30 years. What followed over the next decade was the kind of career most performers spend entire lifetimes trying to construct. Album after album reaching the top of the charts across multiple countries. A Christmas record that became one of the best-selling albums of its era in any genre. Sold-out world tours in arenas that held tens of thousands of people who sang every word back at him without prompting. And yet, the real story was never only in the music. Behind every confident performance, behind every smooth television appearance, there was a private life that the public persona had been carefully constructed around. And in 2016, those two worlds collided with a force that no professional preparation could absorb. Michael Bublé married Argentine actress Luisana Lopilato in March 2011 in Buenos Aires. He had spent his 20s and early 30s building a career. Now at 35, he was building something different. Something that did not need an audience to have value, something that existed entirely for its own sake. Their first child, Noah, was born in August 2013. Their second, Elias, followed in January 2016. Michael spoke about fatherhood in interviews with a quality of feeling noticeably different from how he spoke about music, more unguarded, more directly connected to whatever was actually true for him beneath the professional surface. The charm was still present, but underneath it, something more honest was showing through. The family settled into a life on two registers simultaneously. There was the public register, the tours, the recordings, the Christmas albums that arrived each year with the reliability of the season itself, and there was the private register, the ordinary rhythms of parenthood, the specific texture of a life that fame had not yet entirely consumed. What no vigilance could prevent was what arrived in November 2016, and when it arrived, every carefully maintained boundary between the public and the private became suddenly completely irrelevant. Noah Bublé was 3 years old when he was diagnosed with hepatoblastoma, a rare form of liver cancer that primarily affects young children. 3 years old, the age when the world is still primarily a place of discovery and wonder, when the whole of a life is still entirely ahead and entirely unwritten. The diagnosis arrived in November 2016. Michael and Luisana were in the middle of one of the most professionally successful periods of his career. A new album had just been released. Tour dates were confirmed across multiple continents. The machinery of commercial music, once set in motion at a certain scale, does not easily stop. There are contracts, commitments, crews whose livelihoods depend on the calendar holding. None of it mattered? Michael and Luisana announced through a brief statement that they were stepping away from all professional commitments to focus on Noah's health. The statement was notable for what it did not contain: no carefully managed emotional language, no strategic framing, no attempt to control the narrative beyond the essential facts. Their son was sick, they were going to be with him, everything else would wait. The music industry understood. Tour dates were canceled without the usual contractual friction, label commitments were quietly deferred. The people who worked with Michael recognized, without needing it spelled out, that the calculation had changed completely. This was not a scheduling problem. This was a family in crisis, and the professional world would arrange itself around that reality. What no announcement could capture was what was actually happening inside that family in the months that followed: the treatments, the waiting, the specific quality of hope that exists in a children's oncology ward, fragile and fierce simultaneously, alive in the faces of parents who have learned to read the small signs that doctors use to communicate what the larger picture is not yet ready to confirm. Michael Bublé had spent his entire adult life in relationship with audiences. From the wedding receptions of his early career to the arenas of his peak years, there had always been a version of himself that existed for other people's experience, always a face turned outward, always a voice directed at a room. The warmth was genuine, but it was performed warmth in the sense that performance requires directed, shaped, offered. The year that followed Noah's diagnosis was the first sustained period of his adult life in which he was not performing for anyone. There were no audiences, there were no cameras, there was only the hospital and the treatment schedules, and Luisana beside him, and Noah in the room beyond the door. He was not Michael Bublé, the performer, during those months. He was Michael, a father in a hospital, doing what fathers do, sitting with the uncertainty, learning the names of the doctors, asking the questions that needed to be asked, and staying. Simply staying because leaving was not possible and would not be considered. There is a kind of stripping away that happens in those circumstances that cannot be replicated by any deliberate practice of humility. When the thing you love most is threatened, everything that is not essential falls away without effort or intention. The career, the reputation, the professional identity, the accumulated symbols of success, all of it becomes instantly and completely secondary, not through a decision, but through a simple recognition of what actually matters and what does not. The world kept moving while he was still. His voice drifted through other people's kitchens and living rooms, and the particular irony not lost on anyone who knew the circumstances: hospital waiting rooms, a voice associated with warmth and the assurance that good things were still possible, playing through the speakers of the very spaces where people were learning that the world does not always cooperate with that assurance. Luisana Lopilato handled the public dimension of Noah's illness with a grace that was its own form of courage. She posted occasionally, not managing a narrative, but sharing at intervals what was true. The posts were honest in the way that only things written from inside a crisis can be honest. They did not pretend everything was fine. They did not perform strength for an audience. She wrote about Noah's spirit, about his humor, which survived the treatments with the native resilience of children who have not yet learned to be afraid of their own fragility. She wrote about the kindness of the medical staff, about small victories that existed in a register entirely different from the victories that fill entertainment news. She wrote about Michael, about a man who was entirely present, not managing the situation from a distance, not protecting himself from the full weight of what was happening by staying busy with things that felt more controllable. A man who sat in the room and held his son and was simply completely there. This was not a public relations position. This was a woman writing from inside one of the hardest experiences of her life, and what she wrote about her husband was what she actually saw.
The smoothness of the stage persona had always contained something real underneath it. What the year of Noah's illness did was remove everything except the real thing, and let anyone paying attention see it directly, without the professional wrapping that had always surrounded it before.
While Michael was absent from the professional world, his music was not absent from the world. The Christmas albums continued to play in December homes across the world. People who knew what the Bublé family was going through listened differently. The warmth that had always been there acquired a new quality. Not the warmth of someone for whom warmth is easy, but the warmth of someone who knows what coldness feels like and is choosing, against that knowledge, to offer something else. This is the strange alchemy that biography performs on art. The work does not change when you learn the life behind it, but your experience of the work changes permanently, irreversibly. You hear something in the voice that you could not have heard before you knew what it had passed through, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Michael Bublé's catalog acquired a new layer of meaning during the year of his absence, a layer that had always been structurally possible in the music, but that the context had not previously activated. The layer of someone who genuinely understands what it means to need the things those songs are about: warmth, connection, love that survives difficulty, the grace of ordinary joy in the face of its possible absence. The music had always been emotionally intelligent. Now it was also, for anyone who knew the story, emotionally true in a way that went beyond craft. And that truth would follow Michael back to the stage when he was ready to return. In early 2017, Noah's treatment showed the results the family had been hoping for. The cancer responded. The protocols the oncology team had designed with careful precision began to produce measurable, verifiable improvement. The direction had changed. The darkness had a visible edge. Luisana posted that the news was good, that they were cautiously, carefully, gratefully moving toward the outcome they had been working toward. The post reached millions of people who had been following the family's journey with genuine human concern, the kind that attaches to stories about children and illness and parental love because those stories touch something universal that transcends the specific identities involved. The return to music was not immediate. The healing that needed to happen was not only in Noah's body, but in the family's relationship with everything the previous year had contained. You do not simply step back onto a stage after a year in a hospital. The stage exists in a different world, and traveling between those worlds requires more than a flight and a sound check. It requires a reorientation, a recognition of which version of yourself will return, and what that version carries that the previous version did not. Michael took his time, and when he finally returned, what the audience received was not the same performer who had left. The voice was the same, the craft was the same, but something had been added that could not have been acquired any other way. Michael Bublé returned to public life gradually, no dramatic announcement, no staged comeback narrative. He appeared in interviews, he talked about Noah with the careful language of a parent still, in some ways processing the full weight of what had happened. He was warm as he had always been warm, he was funny as he had always been funny, but there was something else now, a quality of earned seriousness that had not been there before, or had been there but concealed beneath the professional smoothness. When he announced a return to touring, the response from audiences was immediate and overwhelming. Not merely the response of fans who had missed the music, but the response of people who understood that this return was evidence, evidence that the thing they had been hoping for had actually happened, that Noah was well enough that his father could stand on a stage again. The first concerts back were described by those who attended them with a consistent quality that was different from how Michael Bublé performances had previously been described. Not more somber, not weighted down by recent history, but deeper. A performer doing the same things he had always done, from a place of greater understanding of why those things mattered. When he sang love songs, the audience heard someone who had been somewhere that love was the only available resource. When he sang the Christmas songs about warmth and home and being together with the people you love, the knowledge of where he had been while those songs played in other people's homes gave the performance a layer of meaning that no technical accomplishment could manufacture. The applause at those first concerts back was real, and it was responding not just to the music, but to the man who had made the choice the music required, the choice to step away when something more important demanded it, the choice to come back when the more important thing had found its way through. Noah Bublé was declared cancer-free. He grew. He became a child who did not know yet the full weight of what his family had navigated on his behalf, the way children are mercifully protected from the complete understanding of their own illness by the same innocence that made them so vulnerable to it. He became a boy who liked things boys like, who made his parents laugh, who existed in the ordinary dailiness of childhood that is the most precious thing in the world and the easiest to take for granted until it is threatened. Michael and Luisana's family continued to grow. Their daughter Vito was born in 2019, and a fourth child, Cielo, followed in 2022. The family that had been tested by the hardest possible year grew outward into the life that year had made them more certain they wanted. Michael's career continued with a depth and consistency that reflected the transformation the silence had produced. His audiences were loyal across generations, people who had grown up with his Christmas albums and people discovering them for the first time, people who knew Noah's story and people who simply knew the music. The warmth coming through the speakers was the same warmth it had always been, but it was carried now by a man with a more complete understanding of what warmth actually costs, what it requires of the person providing it, and what it means to the people receiving it when the world has recently reminded them that warmth is not guaranteed. There is a version of the Michael Bublé story that focuses on the career arc. The debut album, the Christmas records, the sold-out tours, the platinum certifications. That version is accurate and worth telling, but the deeper version is about what the career was built on and what the silence revealed about its foundations. Michael Bublé disappeared in 2016 because his son needed him and nothing else mattered. He returned because his son was healing and the world his music lived in was still there, still needing what his music had always provided, still capable of being touched by a voice that understood, from the inside now and irrevocably what those songs were actually about. The silence was not an interruption of the story. It was the moment the story became complete. The moment when everything he had built was tested against the hardest possible reality and found to be exactly what it had always claimed to be. The warmth was the same, the craft was the same, but underneath both there was now something that only the hardest experiences can give, the knowledge that love is not a performance, not a professional position, but the only thing that is actually real when everything else has been stripped away. Michael Bublé knew that from his grandfather's living room. He learned it again, more completely, in a hospital in 2016. And every song he has sung since carries both of those educations simultaneously, the joy of the one and the depth of the other, inseparable, together forming the voice that millions reach for when they need to feel the world still contains something worth believing in. That is what disappeared in 2016, and that is what came back.